colleagues couldn't join, and therefore will have to benefit from watching the video recording. So you just received the announcement basically to that effect. So these are the housekeeping remarks. In a nutshell, we also have simultaneous translation available into English and Ukrainian. Please select the appropriate channel. And also a kind request from the interpreters to keep it relatively slow. Okay, so let's move on to our formal introduction part. And I would like to give the floor and describe the study and the work that's been put into it. The Director of Sustainable Development, Europe and Central Asia, Mr. Steven Schoenberger. Over to you, Steven.
Well, thank you so much. And I am so excited to be joining everyone for the discussion of this newly released study on Ukraine, building climate resilience in agriculture and forestry. And a special thanks to Deputy Minister Savchuk and Deputy Minister Taras, as well as other partners and colleagues for giving us the opportunity to discuss this with you today. As you are aware, the World Bank is very much involved in research and collaboration with country partners to build resilience to the effects of climate change. While mitigation is an important part of the climate agenda and is at the forefront, so often the aspects of adapting to the actual and expected impacts of climate change are often amongst the hardest challenges. And we are currently the largest multilateral funder of climate investments in developing countries, with $83 billion committed to climate-related investments over the past 5 years. This year was really a turning point for the World Bank in terms of increasing our focus on climate change as really a core element of the overall development agenda. We issued a new 5-year climate change action plan, which includes a focus on identifying and prioritizing actions on the largest mitigation and adaptation opportunities. And under this plan, we identified priority areas to support countries in achieving their climate objectives and building resilience while pursuing broader development agendas. This overall climate change action plan is translated to the country level through what we call climate change and development reports, in which we analyze existing studies, but also undertake additional modeling of decarbonization pathways, adaptation priorities, social implications of both mitigation and adaptation, and the relationship to overall economic and social development in each country. In this first year, we are undertaking 25 of these studies globally, and given the importance of the climate agenda in Ukraine, Ukraine is one of these countries. And as we go forward, we look forward in the preparation of this report to consulting with Ukrainian stakeholders to ensure that this report is as a useful input to the broader efforts to strengthen climate action in Ukraine, as well as in helping to inform our own work with you. Focusing on Ukraine, Ukraine is more commonly associated with climate mitigation and the need to bring down its emissions rather than adaptation. And that, of course, is justified given the high carbon intensity of the economy. However, it's also important for Ukraine to assess the impact of global climate change and what it could do to the economy and society more broadly. In order to plan for its future, it's crucial to ask today, how will climate change impact agriculture in Ukraine, one of the world's largest producers of wheat and sunflower, and a critical country for global food security? How will projected changes in food security also affect people's lives in Ukraine? The bank's newly released Ukraine study, which we'll discuss today, sets out to answer some of these questions. It provides detailed analysis of climate change and the impacts it will have on agricultural output, forests, and household income and poverty indicators. A better understanding of climate risks will allow Ukraine to manage them and prepare for climate change in the most efficient way. We talk about this research as groundbreaking, with its depth of climate data and the fact that it provides the first detailed analysis of how climate change is likely to impact agriculture in the country. It is indeed pioneering. and very much pioneering because it brings that analysis to a much more local level and highlights the differentiation in the impacts of climate change on different regions in Ukraine, and highlights the need for both national, regional, and community authorities to work together to anticipate what is likely to happen and how to come up with strategies that are specific to that region and that locality. In English, we use the term groundbreaking to mean innovative, but literally it means to break the ground as we do when we begin to build a house. We have now broken ground and can build to support Ukraine on climate adaptation. Moving forward, this study will serve as the foundation upon to which build future World Bank engagements in the country, especially the country climate and development report, which will examine how actions in resilience, adaptation, and mitigation can improve Ukraine's development outcomes. And even more broadly, the modeling approaches and findings of this study will inform future studies in other countries as well. I look forward to a fruitful and interesting discussion, and again, thank our Ukrainian friends and colleagues for this opportunity to discuss this with you today. Thank you.
Дякую, пане Стівен, за такий докладний та зрозумілий огляд.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for this very comprehensive assessment of our cooperation. And yes, thank you very much for your opening remarks. Now I'd like to give the floor on to Mrs. Irina Stavchuk, who's Deputy Minister of Environmental Protection and Natural Resources of Ukraine. Irina, over to you. Thank you very much. Greeting, welcome. Mr. Schoenberg, happy to see you. Welcome everyone to this, I think that this year's last big event of this kind. And yeah, I think it's really a great opportunity to discuss the Ukrainian government's priorities, environmental priorities. And I think yeah, we were able to achieve a lot of those priorities this year. And I think, it's a great opportunity to discuss this. So, we've updated and approved our nationally determined contribution, and we submitted in time for the COP26 conference, which I think was a development that led to a lot of buzz, a lot of discussion, and was received very well by our international partners. Now we've introduced a system for greenhouse gas emission monitoring system for large enterprises, as the Ukraine's first, and we've initiated some public consultations with research facilities and international partners to discuss and identify the best possible models for Ukraine carbon quota trading, to help lay the groundwork for the legislation in this field. And I think a lot of you joining today we're a part of this process, and I'm talking about developing our adaptation strategy. Was passed in October this year, and it comes with a sort of an action plan for the next 4 years. And this study, that we're here to talk about today is, a very important milestone in the process of implementation of this adaptation strategy, because to be successful, we need to actually understand the actual impacts and consequences and some of the mitigation strategies. Now we're also finalizing the drafting of the concept paper for the climate change mitigation, and we're doing this together with the Ukrainian Hydrometeorology Institute, to enhance coordination and improve awareness and improve the knowledge levels of, when it comes to climate change mitigation. Now, what makes this study so important? And by the way, many thanks to the World Bank for actually choosing this topic and following through with this study. And it took much longer than expected, but on the other hand, the results are outstanding, very comprehensive results. And Many distinguished experts worked on this study. A lot of experts from Ukraine, as well as a number of international experts from many distinguished international organizations. And you know, people often ask, the media especially, you know, so what should we expect in 10 years, 15 years time when it comes to climate change? So that is exactly what this study is trying to answer, you know, looking at the global trends in greenhouse emissions and potential implications for Ukraine. And you have to understand, you know, the jury is still out on what those future greenhouse gas emissions will look like. There are a couple scenarios, couple feasible scenarios, and obviously the outcomes may be very different. And, you know, the study actually looks up until year 2100 as its sort of a time horizon, and it looks at a number of different scenarios. Now, what's also important is that as a part of the study, we were able to generate a vast body of data for various Ukrainian regions that will help conduct future, more localized studies into climate change impact for those smaller regions, oblasts, municipalities, and it will actually help you inform your decisions going forward, because, you know, climate change impacts are very diverse, you know, when it comes to different districts and different areas of Ukraine. So there's a lot of variability there. So yeah, that's why I think the study is so important, and the amount of data that we're able to generate will surely go a long way towards helping conduct future studies of this kind. Now, also, a study presents a very important look on the agriculture and forestry, you know, two sectors of economy that are already experiencing some setbacks and some major impacts, you know, as we speak. So anyway, thank you for this opportunity. And, you know, we're so happy to present this study. The final text is being finalized, and hopefully we'll be able to publish it on a website within the next couple of days or so. Now, I would like to hand the floor over to Volodymyr Guk from Ministry of Agrarian Policy. Okay. Irina, thank you very much indeed. On behalf of the Ministry of Agrarian Policy, I'd just like to express my appreciation for this tremendous amount of work that's been done by the World Bank. You know, the World Bank has always been a very good partner, and I think have really helped us, you know, drive this process and really promote the idea of actually mitigating climate change impacts. So the ministry has started working in earnest this summer only, you know, due to various reorganizational issues. But, you know, we're becoming more and more active in this process. And, you know, thanks to our long-standing cooperation with the Ministry of Environment, I think we were able to put some good work and make some good progress when it comes to carbon trading for agriculture and the concept and to that effect, basically. So there are a number of persistent challenges in Ukraine, and what happens is that, you know, you have well-established European markets and global markets, right? And if you look at Ukraine, that same market is very much underdeveloped, and this is a gap that we feel needs to be shored up very quickly. And considering the role the government can play in terms of providing stimulus for and helping incentivize some change, right? And then, and we're looking at what we could do, and what we see is that agriculture could and will benefit the most from introducing carbon credit market. And to that effect, government needs to create right conditions to, first of all, increase awareness and create buy-in for our farmers to participate in that system, to participate in that market. And that's exactly what we're doing right now, drafting the appropriate legal framework and working with our international partners, exchanging ideas, experience, and learning more about best international practices in this area to be able to create those right conditions that I alluded to earlier to create these opportunities for our farmers in our agriculture sector. Thank you, Irina. Thank you, Volodymyr. Thank you for your introductory remarks, and thank you for outlining future lines of effort for the Ukrainian government. And hopefully, this study here will be useful. I would also like to welcome Mr. Banerjee, our country director, as someone who helped make this study happen. Welcome. And I'm just looking at my watch, and I think it's time for us to proceed to the next part of our event and talk about the actual study itself. So let me introduce our presenters today. So we have Madhavi Pillai, who is the task team leader for this project and a senior natural resources specialist from the World Bank. We also have Elena Golub, senior economist, Ms. Svetlana Karkovska, who is the head of the Applied Climatology Lab of the Ukrainian Hydrometeorological Institute. Mr. Igor Buksha, who is the head of the Department of Forest Monitoring and Certification from Ukrainian Research Institute of Forestry and Forest Melioration from Kharkiv, Ukraine, and Professor Neil Markandia from Basque Center for Climate Change, BC3.
I am giving floor to Madhvi now to start the presentation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Oksana. Thank you, Deputy Minister Stavchuk, Stephen, and Arup. Thank you for joining this meeting. We just give us 1 minute to have the presentation uploaded. Yes, it's coming up. Just, this is quite interesting. We have 222 participants connected at this point. So that shows there is a lot of interest in this field. So this study actually has been comprehensively explained by both Mr. Stavchuk and Mr. Schonberger. And they really did a very good job in saying why this is important and what is being covered. So our purpose of starting the study was to mainly understand what will happen in the case of Ukraine in terms of the impacts and how will agriculture will be affected by the changing climate. So the focus was looking more at what should we do in terms of adaptation, because that was a less studied agenda, and whereas energy emissions reduction from the energy sector and other sectors has been somewhat more analyzed in the case of Ukraine. And being a very large country, in terms of land mass and the regional variations, it was very hard to see how this, we didn't have one clear picture. It is not a small island where we could talk about, sea level rise. So we thought of going very detailed into the climate projections. So this study, next slide, please. I'll just come to the actual methodology, but just to give you an idea of the number of institutions involved, we had the Basque Center for Climate Change from Spain, the Ukrainian Hydromet Institute, Metro Economica, also based in Spain, and the Ukrainian Research Institute for Forestry, based in Kharkiv, was cooperated closely with us and provided their time, input, and experts to review to carry out this research. In addition, we also had a lot of help from Gerix, based in Germany, as one of the think tanks under the federal government, who helped this process. Next. So this study methodology actually was very simple. It looked at detailed climate projections, and because Ukraine is such a large country and there could be so much variation, it was felt that we needed to get actual and the most latest projections at a detailed level for the country. So Eurocordex was used for this purpose. And for the first time, we have very high resolution climate data for a daily basis for the next, for this entire century up to 2100. So this is a very large, a body of data that's available for further research. For the purpose of this study, we looked at purely the biophysical impacts on agriculture under 3 scenarios, and using some of the most well-known and adapted models, the Wafost model for agriculture, and for forestry using the Borodov Forest Typology Index. And further use the results from the biophysical impacts to look at the economic impacts on agriculture, and then the distributional impacts on household income. Next. So from here, I will hand over to our climate expert. You probably all know her very well, Dr. Svetlana from UHMI. Svetlana, over to you.
Дякую, Мадві. Дуже рада бути присутня і мати можливість.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak about this research. And this research happened a while ago, and now we have the opportunity to present it. So we already heard about the methodology, and I can tell you that in our research, we based ourselves on climate change evaluation using average numbers. So we used average climate information, aggregated information. We did not have a chance to drill down into the details in terms of some extreme weather conditions, but that is to be done in the future. However, to assess biophysical parameters, to assess economic impacts, for this purpose, we understood that this information is sufficient. Therefore, we focused on 20-year periods, which are mentioned here on the slide. We are talking about past, base, near future, mid-century, and end century. And all the indicators were based on the baseline period, which is 1991, 2010. That's our baseline. And we also compared to other periods, such as 1961, 1990. And it's been already mentioned before me that we had very, very detailed information from the European Global Modeling Project, and with granularity to 1/10 of a degree. So a grid was 10 by 10 clicks. We also were using similar granular data from European databases. Next. Speaking about scenarios, we were using scenarios firstly presented in the 5th Interagency Report on Climate Change. And also on this chart, you can see the scenarios from report number 5 and number 4. We want to show that there was a previous assessment made already by our team in our institute, and we did this for scenario A1B, as you can see on your right. And as of now, we look at 3 scenarios, and they are not redundant. They are complementary instead. And these scenarios, they represent concentrations, and these are the numbers 2.6, 4.5, and 8.5. They show low-level, mid-level, and high-level concentrations, and they correspond specific levels of global warming. 2 degrees, which matches the Paris Accord, 2.4 and 4.3 degrees Celsius. Next. Now, this is quite a complicated chart, but it still shows very important data, sets of data, I should say, which were analyzed. These 2 pie charts, they show scenario 2.6 and 4.5, where we had least and most data in the beginning of the research. In this chart, you can find data sets for different scenarios, which we uploaded to the server in our institute. So we have a database which contains 2 terabytes of information. So that's a lot of data. And we were using different operations with this data. We were applying it to different parts of Ukraine. We assembled data in different configurations because that is a tested and proven method for good projections with the lowest level of error. And for the scenario 2.6, unfortunately, at that time in this database, we only had 3 models to use. So the maximum amount of projections was made for other kinds of scenarios, 8.5 and 4.5. Next, please. So these are our projections with regard to temperature change. And we are using the most commonly used parameter. It's called annual temperature for 2 scenarios, 4.5, 8.5. We use maps, as you can see. And also the chart at the bottom shows different levels of warming for Ukraine, for different oblasts. 2.6 for Ukraine means that we will have warming within the 1 degree. Other scenarios by the end of the century talk about high levels of warming, especially scenario 8.5, which goes beyond 8 degrees. And we are looking at the difference now between the 2 scenarios, and it can be interpreted as impact, which can be avoided, so avoidable impact. We have the highest concentration scenario and medium concentration. That means plus 2.5 degrees, which is a lot. Next. And here we have a summary of our projections with regard to changes in temperature, which we received for Ukraine under different scenarios and for different time periods in the future. Also, just to illustrate, we show you temperatures and how they correspond to global warming levels and how the situation will develop with consideration of current modern day existing policies, then declared policies, and that allows us to contrast and compare and see that the estimates for Ukraine, which we received for scenario 2.6, they correspond with the most optimistic scenario, if I may put it this way. And the estimates for 8.5 scenario, which is the most difficult one, in fact, They are not on this thermometer, luckily. So that is a big win for this year, I think. Let's move on. Speaking about precipitation, you can find here different scenarios. As you can see, 8.5 at the bottom, 4.5 at the top. The time frame is 20 years, and this scenario covers all Ukraine. So the annual precipitation is going to increase based on our forecast. In the north of Ukraine, we will have a large increase between 5 and 10%. Speaking about 8.5 scenario, at the end of the century, we have huge difference. We will have a reduction in the southeast and increase in Volyn area in the northwest. Next. Again, if we analyze this information with breakdown by oblast for Ukraine, we can see that for scenario 2.6, as diagrams show relationship between future and amount of precipitation and baseline. As you can see, they're all above 1, which means that we will have more precipitation. And for RCP 4.5, we have even distribution, more or less, of these numbers throughout the 21st century. For RCP 8.5, we see the breakdown by the oblast. That's what we have seen in the original dimension in the previous slide. And it's good that we have detailed forecasts. So if we look at the detailed seasonal forecasts, we can see where the impact is the most, where the risk is the highest, because we see temperature growth and we see precipitation growth, which, as we forecast, will be happening in autumn and in winter. And then in spring and summer, we will have a reduction in the number of precipitation, especially in the southeast and in the south of Ukraine. Besides, we have analyzed more information about municipalities, about urban environment in different parts of Ukraine, and that is an annual dimension, as you can tell. And we are not just looking at seasonal data, but also at monthly data. So we looked at fluctuations, and we see the impacts. In the west, for instance, in Lviv, the maximum amount of precipitation will shift from July to May, and in other parts of Ukraine, this annual flow will be disrupted, will be disturbed. Because again, we've witnessed this in the past, and this needs to be taken into consideration in our planning models for the Ukraine's economy. In this study, we analyzed numerous indicators. We looked at annual data. We were using over 100 indicators. Not all of them were analyzed in detail. However, they all were used in other research in agriculture and in seeding industry. Some of them were analyzed in detail, and we are talking about those that have most impact. So we are talking about the duration of seasons and also increase in temperature during those seasons. Summer days, for instance, where the maximum temperature is over 25 degrees. We're talking about tropical nights when the minimum temperature remains over 20 degrees Celsius. Then frost days, when minimum temperature below 0 remains certain period of time, and ice days. So let's move on. And in this charts, we see also different indicators and assessments and how things will change depending on different scenarios and periods. At the top, you can find indicators that are connected with maximum temperature and minimum temperature at the bottom. We will have an increase in the number of tropical nights, summer days, and the number of cold nights, frost nights, ice days will be less and less. Now, speaking about other indicators which I wanted to show you, which are really important for agriculture and seeding industry. So this is the vegetation season where we have temperature above 5 degrees Celsius and we have lack of moisture in the air on the left, and also the duration of the vegetation period. So these maps show the past, the one on top. The rest are showing development of different scenarios with connection to certain periods of time. So you have seen that there is a prolonged period of vegetation. We have lack of moisture for the next decade. And these are detailed assessments. We have all the data with a breakdown down to 10 kilometers. And that allows us to make quite detailed assessments for oblasts and also for different sectors of economy. Now, I'm giving floor to my colleague who's going to speak about agriculture and impacts on agriculture.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm happy to take the floor from Svetlana and say that the vast amount of information that this study was able to develop is actually very instrumental and makes it possible to consider different scenarios of the future that may happen in different sectors of the economy. And you have seen these big lists. That's what you have to estimate. And they are different for different sectors to understand what will be the impact of climate change in all these sectors. And these indicators actually reflect a current understanding of what are critical parameters that would affect different productivity modes, or how could be revenue collected, and how could be crop produced, how could be harvested different species, and many things in all these sectors. And the amount of data is huge, and they have to be modeled and they have to be put in some analytical structure to understand what could be different scenarios of development and change the behavior, change the policies in a way that Ukraine could adapt to these future changes better in these selected sectors. And we were able to look at two sectors in this study, and we have to give a huge credit to Hydrometeorological Institute and Laboratory of Satellite Application that actually adapted and calibrated their very important models for agriculture in Ukraine. And the model that is used, and we show it in this slide, it's Wafost model. It is a mechanistic model with a solid biophysical basis and widely used to simulate the growth, development, and yield of crops. And to do that, various ecological, biological processes are taken into account. And they take into account, for example, photosynthesis processes, transpiration, respiration, dry matter production, and time step for this analysis is 1 day. So what we were able to do is to incorporate climate change indices developed on the previous step with the help of Svetlana laboratory in this model and produce these impacts, model the impacts that would happen for 5 crops. 8 projections from 8 RCM models were used, and the 2 scenarios, RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. All the information was compared with the baseline period, because that's how we look at the changes. And projections were made for near future, like around 2030 period, and middle century, around 2050 period. So that's also a lot of work with the data that was done in stages. And the most important thing that the team was able to separate the indicators that are most important for different crops to analyze how the yields would be changed. And of course, it's indicators related to temperature, seasonal precipitation, but also so-called carbon fertilization effect, because when carbon concentration in our atmosphere increases, then productivity of some plants increases, but of other plants stays the same. Next slide, please. So in this slide, we show the major result of the study. The yields impacts were analyzed for 5 major crops: barley, maize, soya, sunflower, and wheat. And it is very important to understand that all our scenarios are under a range of uncertainty. And to take into account variability and uncertainty of these projections, the study was able to elaborate low, mean, and high scenarios, projections for each RCP scenario. The mean projection represents the mean value of the modeled yield for within each oblast. And low and high projections, they show the lower percentile, 5th percentile, and upper 95th percentile limit of the modeled yield. And they determine together the 90th% confidence interval for our projections. It is important to look at all possible scenarios. And again, it's a huge amount of information that should be taken into account while elaborating adaptation policies. The range, of course, is associated with the climate variations, because what we project is what we expect in future, but every specific year is different, and that should be taken into account as well, and confidence interval allows to do that. So on average, the projections for winter wheat are expected to go up in Ukraine. However, like I said, the projections, the range of projections differs between oblasts and between low and high scenarios. And this range and general trend is consistent with the projections that has been done for EU countries. There are also potential significant differences between water abundant and water limited scenarios. Our model, it projects only what will happen when we have benefits of, when the Ukraine has benefits of improved water supply. And that would allow increase within the projected scenarios, increase of yields by 20–40% and up to 80% in some areas. However, all these benefits could realize only if it would be policies that would allow for efficient adaptation to new crop zones. For example, winter wheat is expected to shift productivity zone to the north, changing of planting calendar, provision of water, and changing cropping patterns. All these issues are reflected in our report in details, and methodological issues are presented in the annex to the report. Next slide, please. So in this slide, we show a baseline in green of yield for winter wheat and projected changes in winter wheat for 2 scenarios and RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5 around Ukraine. So you see that here we see mostly increase. Yellow is expected increase of mean yield, and orange is even higher increase. Next slide, please. This is, on the other hand, maize, yield for maize. And again, we see base yields and some reduction of yields is projected by year 2030. And why is that? Because we have climate projections reflect reduction of precipitation in spring and summer, and also maize is the type of plant where carbon fertilization is not important for this plant. Next, please. And this is projections of yield for sunflower, where we also have reduction for both scenarios, mostly. But again, I would like to say that what this type of approach allows, it allows to see differentiation among different oblasts and see which oblast should pay attention to different interventions and different crops. And it should be very oblast specific. Next slide. Then this set of maps, it shows how the yields will be affected by the reduction of water stress. And again, here we see increase both in maize in this slide. And next slide, please. And this is for sunflower. Again, even high increase. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the analysis that has been done in other European countries by Joint Research Commission of European Union. And you see that it's interesting, the border countries with Ukraine, they actually, a little bit to the north, the yield for wheat is projected to increase. A little bit to the south, it's projected to decrease, but the analysis is not certain. So what happens is that it shows the importance of working in this direction. And although our analyses are in line with the EU projections, this work has to be continued, and Ukraine has to be analyzed like in details, because it's a huge country, big country, and the impact are so diverse. Thank you, and I want to give floor to our next presenter.
Hello, is it for me to speak now?
Yes, please.
Yes, so we will turn now to some of the impacts, the consequences of these changes that have been described in the agricultural sector on household well-being. And we are doing this by looking at two of the impacts that have been described, that result from the changes in the climate change on agriculture in the country and worldwide. And the two effects that we consider are, one is the effect of higher prices of foods. And this effect has been modeled not just for Ukraine, but in a global model, which looks at the way in which the prices of key staple commodities, like the ones we considered, but also prices of livestock commodities, will change with climate. And because all these products are traded, world prices are expected to rise. And still Ukraine being a major trading country for agricultural products, we would expect that prices, these world price changes will also be reflected in an increase in the price of these food products in the country. At the same time, for the items that have been shown yes, so this slide here shows you what if you take the household expenditure survey and impose upon the individual households the changes in prices that we've talked about, we have an effect, a decline in real income that they will face. Now, these are averages by oblast. The darker the color, the larger the change in real income that these price increases will generate. But this is one of the effects of climate change on countries. The other effect is the consequence of the combination of price increases and yields that have been described by Elena, and the combined the effect of those is to, in general, increase the incomes of households that derive a part of their income, part or on all their income from agricultural activity. So this map here shows you the combination of the two effects, the combination of the effect of the higher prices, which is in general negative because people paying more for food become worse off. But there's a positive effect because to the extent that households that derive their income from agriculture should be slightly better off. In general, the combined effect is negative, and there are three scenarios which have been considered. So we don't get a single number because we get a range, but the increase in food prices is expected to reduce household incomes by between 0.7 and 3% across oblasts, but the reductions are bigger in the lower income quintiles. So the households which are generally poor, relatively poor tend to have a bigger loss than households that are relatively well off. That's not surprising because poorer households spend more of their income on food. And then on the other hand, because the change in farm output, this leads to an increase in household income, and it varies between 0.4% and 1.2%. These are all projections, by the way, assuming, looking at what would happen in around 2030. So income could rise by about 1.6% for households with lower income deciles. And for the low scenario, we don't get such a big gain, but we have in fact a reduction for the lower deciles of between 0.9 and 2.8%. And the combined effect of these two is just shown in this slide. So in the low scenario, households are worse off between 1% and 3% on average. In the mean scenario, they could be either better off or worse off, but the range is between 1% worse off or 1% better off. And if the high scenario prevails, then the households gain between 0.2, 0.5 and 3%. These are averages, and they vary a lot between oblasts, as we saw in the map. And one exception, of course, even to the general remarks here is Kiev City, where the people don't derive any income from agriculture. They just have the higher price effect, and they tend to have a larger negative impact from the expected changes. So these are some of the gainers and losers. As I say, that there's a lot more detail once we start to look at individual oblasts and look at the effects by decile, so we can see how much effect there is, particularly on the lower deciles and on poverty. And this is all reported is all provided in the report. Thank you. Thank you. Move on. Is that the...
Наступне питання стосується лісів, і я хочу...
the next issue concerns forests and forestry. I'd just like to take a few moments of your time to present some of those results. So we used modeling of conditions of Ukraine's territory for growing various forest timbers, and most of them, the most prominent ones that we looked at are spruce, beech, hornbeam, pine, oak, alder, birch, and locust. So we looked at the suitability of conditions at two different levels. So we used the Professor Vorobjov's forest typology to look at the ecosystems, and then we used a Dido model to assess the tolerance amplitude of trees, of plants, basically, and their tolerance to changing environmental indicators, the most significant of them being precipitation, temperature, and among other things. And one of the key prerequisites for suitability is available humidity. So sensitive of forest. Okay, can you go one slide back, please? Yes, this one. So sensitivity of forest timber has to do with various meteorological factors. So, and as the sensitivity grows, and actually this is what you can see on the slide, that the Norway spruce is the most sensitive one, followed by beech, followed by common hornbeam, followed by pine, oak, and black locust, eventually remaining the most tolerant species.
Можуть мати різнонаправлений характер в залежності від конкретних умов. Наприклад,
again, the impact will depend on the conditions. If we have highly moistured area, the lack of precipitation can have a positive impact. But if the changes are rapid with regard to the levels of precipitation, that may deteriorate the condition because those trees won't have enough time to adapt to the change. So we saw the tendency of an increase of climate change impact on woods, and the trend is from northwest to northeast. That's how the change is occurring. Next slide, please. On this slide, you can see the trend I just mentioned, because Ukraine is special because of the special area where all the three species are growing along the borders of their natural habitat. And when we have an increase in drought, that will impact plantations of trees. You can see this from the slide. The tendencies in both scenarios are similar. We have deterioration of condition for the trees, and that will be observed more in the south and in the east, and to a lesser extent around Carpathian Mountains and in the west of Ukraine. In spite of these tendencies being similar, but the time difference between RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5 is around 40 years. So the changes which are going to take place under RCP 4.5 will be delayed by 40 years. So this is the projected climate change effects on the habitat suitability for two key forestry species. So we were using GIS technology for the above-mentioned types of timber, and the spatial analysis shows the key tendencies that will occur if those scenarios materialize. The key ones are the following. So we have a shift of natural habitat. Then the zones and the types of vegetation will change. The tree formations and the types of forests will change. Their resilience to pests and to disease will decrease. And that will increase more dry, the amounts of dry wood, and that will increase the number of forest fires, especially when we talk about pine forests, for instance. Also, the type of timber, its quality, and its efficiency will be reduced. And that also will impact the amounts of accumulation of carbon. Because again, the types of timber will change. We'll have more of invasive types of vegetation in the woods, and that will impact the biodiversity of the woods. It will impact the number of types with narrow climatic range, and also it will impact endemic species. On this slide, you can see the impact of climate change on areas potential for growing the selected forest species. And the more widespread is the type of timber, such as oak, this ratio will become more large scale. Let's say if we compare that with pine or spruce, which grows in Carpathians, and the areas of growth are not as large, hence the impact would be not as big for this type of timber. But these two main species, oak and pine, in plain forests, and then in Carpathian we have spruce, for instance, or Scots pine, or Norway spruce, European beech, so that they will suffer a lot of impacts because of climate change, but the degree of change varies. The largest change will happen to the English oak because it is covering large territories in Ukraine, then Scots pine, then European beech, and Norway spruce. As researchers already mentioned, under the project, they collected a lot of climate data, which can be used for regional level assessments and for more in-depth research of climate effects on woods, on forests in the area. Thank you. Over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Igor. So this brings us to the final part of our presentation of the study that was conducted. As you saw, this study was very technical and involved a lot of modeling and looking at results. And part of the reason that it took much longer was for the experts to make sure that some of the data and the models were run several times to make sure that the results that were coming were indeed robust. This is important because there are lots of variations across the country because this data was coming from a very detailed high resolution grid of 10 by 10 kilometers square. So that is one of the reasons it was delayed, but it was also delayed, of course, due to COVID, and some of our own team members were directly impacted. So with that, I just will run through some of the key recommendations we made as part of this report. The first recommendation indeed is about strengthening institutions and policy and planning based on what we see. Definitely the importance for adaptation planning is very high. The need to coordinate between ministries to make sure that the work that has been done on climate research is important and equally essential for whether it is on water resources or health or agriculture. Unless these ministries are able to coordinate and share the research findings, it's very difficult to have a good adaptation planning. In the same line, coming to the Ministry of Agrarian Policy and Food, one of the key recommendations is to ensure that there is a dedicated team that looks at how can this information and adaptation to climate change become part of the ministry's planning and programming as it goes forward. Because as we see, there are possibilities for higher productivity, but there are also a lot of risks because of the changing temperature and precipitation and patterns, and especially in the summertime. So having this information integrated into the policy and planning of Ministry of Agrarian Policy is something which should be considered soon. And the last part of our recommendation relates to oblast level planning. And because now there is a substantial body of data and information that can be used by the oblasts to look at what needs to be done in the eastern side, which will be very different from the central and the northern and northwestern oblasts. So this will help oblasts make much more realistic plans, and we hope. The other part of our recommendation relates to increasing and strengthening the scientific capacity. We were very grateful and fortunate to have Ukrainian scientific teams working on this report, but we also recognize that there is a lot more that can be done to strengthen the teams and the institutional capacity, both hardware and software and through personnel. So this is something we think, to be able to use even the data that was generated by this study, it's really essential. Next. And the last part concerns, in terms of agriculture and forestry, what should be done to make this based on what we see from this exercise. There's a lot of information already and a lot of knowledge and awareness about climate smart agriculture. And that is something which should be promoted as much as possible. For forestry sector, because the planning and the whole time scale is very different, it's a long-term planning exercise. It's really important to start now to look at what could be the potential changes even in the species composition, as you just heard, and how should the forestry strategy take this into account? Should there be trials for more drought and heat-resistant species, timber species? How do you deal with invasive species that may be taking over the forests? So these are some really important questions, which we hope the forestry community in Ukraine will take into account and start planning with that. And the one other point which we wanted to bring to your attention was related to increasing the adoption of climate smart technologies, reducing inputs such as fertilizers, and increasing other technologies such as precision agriculture to farmers, but to make sure available incentives to farmers to adopt such technology. So with that, we come to the close of this presentation, and we thank you for your patience. We are a bit running over time, but we really thank you for your patience. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. And we would like to go quickly to our next session, which is a panel discussion. We have invited 3 panel members to join us and to give us their perspectives coming from different spheres in terms of their work. The first person I would like to introduce is Yevgenia Zasyatko. She is the head of the Climate Change Department at the Center for Environmental Initiatives, or EcoAction, and also an expert on the Climate Action Network of Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Yevgenia is joining us to present some perspectives from the civil society. Could we have the questions for her, please? So our questions pertaining to this study and the report, we wanted to ask, what is the experience, especially from EcoAction, with respect to communications and awareness about climate risks and impact in Ukraine? And what do you think would be the use of such studies as this one? And where do you see the role of government in terms of focusing, what is the action that is expected in terms of adaptation? Thank you.
Доброго дня, дуже дякую за запрошення, за цей захід.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. We have been looking forward to get the data, to get the research done, and actually see how climate change can impact different sectors, because in Ukraine, we don't have enough of this kind of research. Allow me to start sharing my experience. The first experience had to do with the analysis of climate impact on rising sea levels, especially in Ukraine, because it's been discussed globally now, quite broadly. There is a modeling exercise of its impacts to New York City, Venice, some other big cities globally. Similar modeling has been done for Ukraine, but we wanted to drill into the details. And we finally got that researched, and it's available on our website. And the research shows that over 1 million hectares of land can end up underwater. And that includes thousands of hectares of arable land. Thousands of population can become climate migrants and refugees. And the climate policy over these years was not ambitious in our country. And the government did not revise the national contribution yet. Now we have more ambitious objectives compared to the previous years. And back then we tried to raise the discussion. We wanted to raise these issues to the level of the state from the local level, because, you know, the research covered coastal areas of Ukraine, where we have 5 oblasts, and they will be impacted directly from those emerging risks. Also, we have quite a recent study which is about how climate change can impact water resources in Ukraine, because we are not the most provided country with water from the European countries. We rank 17, I think, in terms of water supplies. And out of 181 countries globally, we rank 124th place. So in general, this is a very pressing issue for us. And water management in Ukraine is lacking in general. And because of climate change, the levels of water will also change. And it's important also to understand that this resource is heavily used in agriculture and many other sectors as well. And current use is not effective. That needs to be revised. And also water pollution. That is very big. A lot of water use is taking place by utility companies and also in agriculture, and they mostly use surface water, and the rivers may run dry at some point, or the water levels will seriously decrease. So in this research, we tried to use previous studies held in Ukraine just to build a big picture and understand what the risks are for different territories in Ukraine. This research is available, and I've seen in the chat that there are different representatives from different levels of government and parts of Ukraine. So I think that this research should be interesting for you to understand what the risks are and what do you need to focus on. Maybe you will need additional research just to understand what needs to be done in your territorial community or at the oblast level. So even after the national contribution was established and the government is talking about this as a very important issue, it's a priority, but still, from the standpoint of real actions, that's what's lacking. And we, for example, had in September 2021 this March for Climate, and we were trying to fundraise for adaptation and mitigation, and we analyzed whether they accepted our demands after the march, but they only partially accepted them because they said we don't have enough funding in this sector. And it's been mentioned that they plan to do some modeling about of the risks stemming from some natural disasters. And the ministry previously mentioned that Ukraine lost over 25 billion hryvnia just to overcome and mitigate natural disasters. And we're losing money. We keep losing public funds, but we are doing nothing to prevent them, to prevent these bad processes. So unfortunately, all these declarations about relevance and urgency, they are not really in touch with reality. So it's very hard for me to focus on a specific area. The climate change is ongoing as we speak, and it's speeding up. It's very hard to choose one or two areas to focus on. For me, it's important to be present everywhere in all the areas to be able to adapt and be ready for the expected change. The global temperature is rising. The emissions are rising as well.
Ці зміни в будь-якому випадку будуть відбуватися, але питання...
These changes are bound to happen one way or the other. It's the scale that matters. Now, we conducted at the Climate Net, we conducted a survey back in 2020, and the results show that 97%, apologies. Oh, yeah, okay. 44% of Ukrainians have noticed climate change, have witnessed climate change. And obviously the topic is becoming ever more relevant for them. Now, as to when asked what the government should do, 93% responded that cities and municipalities and communities need to be upgraded and need to adapt. And if you look at all the modeling, what's going to happen is that global population will continue to grow, urban population will continue to grow, and all the way up to 68%. And according to Ukrainian estimates, we are at 57% right now. So, we have a lot of people living in cities, and our cities haven't adapted to climate change yet. We lack green spaces. The development pace is rampant, and as I alluded to earlier, the water resources study, and water resources is a very important sector for us, and I think we should look into it in more detail, on an oblast basis, and come up with plans, with action plans. And I think it's up to communities and cities to actually lead the charge by bringing together all these different sectors, including energy efficiency, agriculture, etc. You know, and keep adapting for the climate change.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Could we now move to our next panel member, Evgen Groza from the UNDP. He is the regional project manager for the EU for Climate program, which covers the 6 Eastern Partnership countries, including Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, and Moldova, which is supporting the countries in developing their strategic climate policies and their documents such as the low emissions development strategy documents, finalizing their nationally determined contributions and the national adaptation plans. He was also previously involved working with the EBRD and the World Bank on mitigation methodologies based on the EU emissions trading schemes, etc. So today he is here representing the EU for Climate and the work that is being done on the adaptation strategy in Ukraine. So Evgen, thank you for joining us. And we would like to ask you 2 questions. And if you could please focus on how would the analysis from this particular study be useful and the data that it has generated, especially at the oblast level, from your experience in preparing the adaptation strategy for Ukraine? And what kinds of gaps and in terms of knowledge and financing or in terms of policies do you see further? Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Madai, for the introduction and for the questions. Колеги, доброго дня. Сьогодні
Colleagues, good afternoon. I'm here today to present the results of the EU for Climate team's work. As has been mentioned already, EU for Climate supports Eastern Partnership countries in developing strategic policies on climate change. And for countries of our region of Annex 1, Belarus and Ukraine, that is, we conducted a lot of work to prepare adaptation plans, and in Ukraine we have developed environmental adaptation strategy passed quite recently back in October. So the adaptation strategy actually looks at cities and communities as some of those most vulnerable areas when it comes to climate change. So overheating, heat waves in cities, increased costs due to need to cool the premises down as a result of growing mean temperatures. Urban infrastructure, including sewage systems, will need to be adapted to accommodate increased precipitation levels and prevent flooding. Ukraine lacks some of its water resources, and we can expect water deficit going forward. So urban infrastructure, healthcare, transportation in cities will definitely feel the effect of climate change going forward. So in response to first question, the adaptation strategy was put together with the implementation plan, as a package, and the plan contains very specific, very concrete steps and activities. Each sector, including cities and communities, need to get ready and need to prepare for climate change and include adaptation into their development plans and development strategies. EU for Climate will continue to help develop methodological guidelines, presentation of the guidelines slated for 2022. And the guidelines will look at risk assessment for local policies, biodiversity, and coastal areas, among other things. So, and I highly encourage everyone to get themselves involved, and participate in this work and provide their feedback. Now, the results of the study presented today by the World Bank will surely be useful, because our work is evidence-based and needs to have data to work with, and based on that data, communities will then be able to develop their own adaptation strategies and use them as tools, and means to mitigate climate change risks. Now, as to the second question, the experience and gaps in policy and financing and knowledge. Well, the adaptation strategy was being prepared in a very sort of active period of time, and it was a very lively sort of project. A lot of people were involved. Initially, the Ministry of Environment sent out a call for everyone to join in the process, and we had a whole bunch of people from the ministries, NGOs, business, academia, so pretty much across the board. And on March 1, we published the draft 1 of the strategy. Since that time, we've had more than a dozen working group meetings. We received hundreds of comments and remarks from the working group members. And as far as the knowledge issue is concerned, well, I think every sector will benefit from building their knowledge as to available tools and adaptation strategies and their implementation. So actually, to achieve exactly that, EU for Climate launched a series of 6 workshops dedicated to climate change, looking specifically at risk assessment, policy, and financing, and looking at different individual sectors, including energy, agriculture, transportation, amongst others. Now, as to where the adaptation stands on the spectrum of government priorities, well, we did an assessment, and it seems that unfortunately, adaptation strategy-related issue and climate change-related issues aren't particularly high on the list of government priorities, and there is no sort of a single centralized law to regulate and cover these issues. So there's no systematic approach, I would say. Now, looking at different oblasts, and we conducted a SWOT analysis of oblast development strategies, and unfortunately, as it stands right now, those strategies don't provide for any means or tools to mitigate climate change, and climate change isn't exactly high on the list of priorities of local authorities either, and the cities and municipalities lack a unified approach to planning of adaptation. There are, however, sustainable development and energy efficiency plans in place. So what this means is there's a lot of work ahead of us. We have got to conduct a cross-sectoral integration of climate change related issues and data strategy related to issues, integrate them into development strategy across the board, and pass the climate law as well, something that we do not have, and also create coordination arrangement and mechanisms, interagency and intergovernment coordination arrangements and mechanisms. So yes, we have our work cut out for us, and next year we'll continue doing our SWOT analyses, and we'll continue offering our assistance in developing adaptation strategies. So thank you very much for welcoming and inviting us here today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Evgen, and we look forward to collaborations on this issue further. Now, I would like to introduce our next panelist, Professor Anatoly Shvidenko. And he, as many of you may be aware, is a very well-known forest researcher. He's based in the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria, and has written extensively about forest ecosystems and the impact of climate on forest ecosystems, as well as the impact of forest ecosystems on global biogeochemical cycles. And he has co-authored authored several scientific publications on the topic. Now, Professor Shvidenko, based on what you have seen regarding the forest results on forest ecosystems in this study, and what do you see are likely implications? Because you've also analyzed this subject for the rest of Europe. And what would be your advice to the government to manage these risks to Ukrainian forests?
Many thanks. Пані та панове, зараз у нас наша громада.
Ladies and gentlemen, there are 200 of us here, slightly less, and I think that just goes to show how important this topic of discussion is, because we're not just talking about the study results here. We go beyond this. We are discussing the future of Ukrainian nation, its very survival. I would go as far as saying, and the situation based on what we've been told today and what the science is telling us, the situation isn't overly optimistic, unfortunately. And I'm very well familiar with the work of the team there, and as a senior person, as someone who has been involved in this area for many years now, this study is one of the best I've seen, and it's not really even down to the scientific depth and breadth, of which there's a lot. But due to the fact, I think that the authors really give us an understanding of what they think and what they expect is most likely to happen in the future. So before I proceed with my remarks to these questions, I'd just like to say a few words. Although I'm a climate scientist, I'm also a forester by trade, and just looking back into history, what we were taught as students isn't necessarily true these days. And although we have great soil, we've got great climate, well, maybe with the exception of some areas down south. So if we continue doing the right thing, we were told the country will never run out of bread, they said. And now, if you look at what's happening, you know, and you look especially at what's happening down south and the arid conditions that are setting on there, you know, the situation isn't very good, you know, and so yes, once again, science needs to lead the way, you know, science needs to inform everything, policy included. And the big question is, you know, what do you do? What do you do when you don't really know what to do? You know, whether we just admit we're helpless, but that's not exactly the right solution, I think. Or we can say, well, RCP 8.5 will never happen, but what if it does? You know, so the study here, I think, is a first step towards actually realizing one very important fact, that you know, climate change is essential, is critical for our survival. So that's something that needs to be at the forefront of modern science, and not just particle physics, right? Now, going back to the question here, what would I advise? And, you know, I'm not going to criticize anyone, and I'm not in the business of criticizing anybody. I just like to state a fact. You know, if I were asked the question, what should the government do? So the answer is very simple. Well, turn your face back to forests and forestry. Because, you know, 25 years into Ukraine's independence, I mean, we all saw the mismanagement that took place and how it hurt forests, and not just in Ukraine, but other countries as well. And to me, this is just a lack of understanding. People just don't know what they're doing. You know, they don't understand the science. So that's my first answer right now. Second answer. I mean, Dr. Buxen can correct me if I'm wrong, but how many different regulations and laws and decrees had been passed in Ukraine? Countless numbers. How many were implemented? Well, not that many. So you actually, and we've discussed this. You know, you've got to start with developing a proper framework, proper legal framework. We've got to have our forestry strategy, a mandatory document for all the different sectors and industries. And yeah, I'm almost done here. So something that it just needs to happen. Forest is not just a resource. It's not a commodity. It's much more than that.
Хто це зробив? Ну, будь ласка, лісова стратегія Європейського Союзу.
There is the EU forest strategy adopted in September 2012. And you know, I am an old Ukrainian forester, and it's important to understand how those other countries implement this policy, and such a policy can become a foundation for everything. In every document, every policy, they all need to be enforced and implemented, and the forest strategy has to be a part of the Ukrainian constitution. And in our institute, we work a lot on this mid-latitude ecotone, as they call it. And there are so many interesting things which are applicable to Ukraine. And especially, you know, in the mountains of West Siberia, our climate experts applied scenarios for CP 8.5 type and average temperature there would increase by 4.5 from the climatic standard, and things Ukraine is now experiencing will happen all over that territory. Thank you for your attention. This ends my presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Svidenko. Now I would like to hand it over to our MC Oksana for the last part of this session regarding questions and answers.
Дякую, пані Мадві.
Thank you so much. Now let's talk about questions. The first question was about impacts on fisheries. And I'm going to ask Elena Holub to answer that question.
Just to answer the question, the fisheries was not analyzed as a specific sector in this report. The analysis on impact on agriculture was focused on the key crops that we discussed today: sunflower, wheat, maize, barley, and soybean. Oh, sorry, can you hear me now? Yes. So just to clarify that we did not analyze the fisheries sector in this report and for this study, but the key crops such as wheat and sunflower and barley and maize were analyzed in detail in terms of yield and total production value. I hope that answers the question.
Can I add a little bit? So we didn't analyze fisheries sector, we didn't analyze transportation, energy sectors. And pretty much in every sector of economy in Ukraine will be impact of climate change. However, the project created a huge database that right now the Hydrometeorological Institute is holding. And the way to understand this data and to develop them and present and use for future forecasts in different sectors. So, and that's what we are hoping the government of Ukraine will pick up, and that's part of our recommendations. Thank you.
Дякую. Тепер в чаті було кілька питань щодо...
Thank you. Also, people are asking where this report is going to be published and whether today's recording will be published somewhere. So I'm going to give floor to Irina, and Irina knows more about this, and she will be able to respond. Irina, over to you. The report will be produced in several versions. There will be full Ukrainian and English versions, and also there will be executive summaries with key recommendations and conclusions. It will be also published in 2 languages, and brief reports will be published soon on the Environmental Ministry's website. The long versions are still being worked on because they are very technical. They are quite voluminous. So I think in the first half of January, that will be published on the ministerial website. And at the same time, as I said, we will be cooperating with the Institute in terms of access to data, and we will make an announcement how you can use this data, how you can work with that at the level of regional research institutions, oblast administrations, and all other stakeholders. You can use this data for your purposes, and that is going to be raw data. If you need more high-quality research, you need to give this data to researchers who know how to use this data and how to generate and design scenarios and modeling for different parts of the country and different sectors of economy. Xavier asked about impacts of increase in technology and investment in agriculture, and how climate change will impact on agriculture as well. So the response was as follows. There will be an increase in climate impacts under this kind of scenario of agricultural development. So we have to research this topic even further, because we need to understand how more intense agriculture will become in terms of technology and capital investment and all that. So thank you so much for that. Then I think Mr. Chizhenko wanted to ask something. I see you raised your hand. I was not going to ask a question. I wanted to make a few comments. My name is Mikhailo Chizhenko, and I am from the Ministry of Environment, and I work in the unit responsible for adaptation measures. The Ministry of Agriculture, Volodymyr Gerasimchuk from the ministry was asking about fisheries, and this is what I can say. Volodymyr, look, back in 2018, there was a very good research based on which 1 year later in 2019, and by the way, the Ministry of Agriculture was working on this, and I was a member of the working group. So they developed a strategy and the action plan for adaptation of agriculture, fisheries, and forestry. And this document was already published in 2020. Then the ministries were reformed, and this document is still available. It just needs to be found. And this document has answers to your questions. So Irina also mentioned important things, and I want to add, please, this is for your information. We have a project, and this project has a component about developing adaptation strategies and development of adaptation measures. And under this project, the first draft of guidelines have been already prepared with regard to adaptation, with regard to different development programs at the regional level. And this methodology is now being tested at the level of the regions. And I think that at the end of January, we will have the final version available in Ukrainian, by the way. And within this project, they develop an adaptation strategy for 3 parts of Ukraine: Lviv, Mykolaiv, even Ivano-Frankivsk Oblast. So then we will convene a large working group to refine the guidelines once again, so that we could use them regionally and also at the level of communities. And things that they presented to us today is wonderful foundation, scientific foundation for development of more methodologies and scenarios, because in Kyiv, no one's gonna create those local plans for you. We can only help you prepare a research with the help of other projects. We can help you with methodology guidelines, but the situation is very diverse, even within one oblast. We give you all the fishing equipment, but you gotta fish yourself. And, you know, I don't want to spoil the news, but we will have a few more projects on adaptation next year to be announced next year. So, but without cooperation with local communities, that would not be possible. But now I want to thank you for this conference. I used to work in the Academy of Science, and I'm telling you that this research is very, very big, and I totally support it. Thank you once again for doing it, and thank you for your attention. Right, then there was a question from Ale about the mechanisms of incentives for investing into agriculture and agricultural technologies, and how World Bank helps with that. So World Bank cooperates in this regard, and there are conditions for agricultural projects. And these projects are supposed to use smart technologies, including technologies for protecting soil. And we have a few projects where we cooperate with regard to land resources in the area of agriculture of Ukraine, and all these important aspects are there, and they help adapt to climate change. Then there was another question about carbon certificates and whether the carbon certificates market is going to be developed in Ukraine. Well, in the very beginning of this presentation, it's been mentioned that they are now working on this issue. I think I have someone, Volodymyr, here who is ready to respond to that question. Well, speaking about recommendations, that's right. This question has to do with the climate zone where our agricultural producers exist. And that's why we're talking about change in methodology and recommendations. As soon as the baseline is defined, then the market players who deal with calculation of carbon emissions, they run different analysis and then produce recommendations with regard of the climate at the territory and the features of the soil. Also speaking about development of the market of carbon credits. I mentioned this in the very beginning. This is one of the key things from the standpoint of incentivizing development of climate adaptation. That's a priority for us. And today, there is no legal framework for transactions in carbon credits, which will be supported by certificates. So we believe it's expedient to create preconditions at the legislative level to allow for a market like this. Thank you. There were a few messages as well. Oksana mentioned examples of research by EcoDia NGO. Thank you for that. Andriy shared some research with regard to the impact of climate change on water resources. And then if you follow the link, you can find Ukraine's brief. Then another participant is asking about consideration of changes in prices. And the response was that in that impact model, this aspect is taken into consideration. Thank you. Also, there was another question about the invasive species and which species are promising and that can be grown successfully in Cherkasy region. Well, the research is still trying to identify whether this type of timber is invasive or not. But speaking about species that are promising for Cherkasy region, I will refer this question to Igor. Igor, do you have any recommendations for that part of Ukraine? Now, speaking about Rubilia pseudoacacia, it's a very sensitive question. Firstly, if the climate change happens under RCP 4.5 scenario, then we can probably talk about forestry which is close to natural, and the species would be probably the same as we had during previous years. But if the change is more significant and fast in terms of timing and temperature under RCP 8.5, then this will create a different situation where we start losing conditions for existing species. They will not be able to grow anymore. So
вони тільки будуть єдиними, які ми можемо використовувати для
only
лісового господарства чи для
acacia
Це перший коментар. Другий коментар.
and some similar species
У нас велика площа акацієвих
can grow in that area. So,
вкрай важливі функції по попередженню ерозії ґрунтів.
and a lot of acacia is used to fight erosion. And this species is very useful. It gives you a lot of advantages. So we have to treat it well. We have to nurture this.
Тобто не провокувати системою рубок непродуманих, а проводити заходи відповідно для того, щоб ця порода
We must apply measures so that this species does not become invasive. I do not know why this council decided that this is an invasive species, because many researchers believe that acacia is quite useful species. In Hungary, they produce it as a business. And speaking about other species, which in future will be quite promising, which will be sustainable. Mostly we are talking about some resistant species resistant to dry climate. And in this case, we just need to use experience of Turkey, for instance. So just have a look at what they grow. And for that, we need to conduct research. And then we will see what kind of species can grow in Ukraine. And the researchers are watching them now with regard to future production and how invasive they can become. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your response. I hope this response was useful. Okay, next question. About fisheries. And as I said, we did not look into fisheries separately. There was no separate research for that.
Будемо продовжувати роботу в цьому напрямі, ми зможемо тоді розглянути також.
Potentially in the future, we'll be able to look into this problem as well. Yeah, people from Mykolaiv Oblast say that they're looking forward to receiving methodological guidelines. Yeah, I guess you mean the study, right? Yeah, for sure. And expecting the Ministry of Environment people to meet with them in January. Yeah, that's a great idea. So yeah, so we're out of questions at the moment. Oh yeah, I think we have Mr. Andriy Dimidenko with a question there. Thank you very much indeed. I would just like to congratulate colleagues on the study here, you know, and so alongside top-down circulation modeling, there are bottom-up type models based on communities, and looking into adaptation measures, including early warning and economic impact, you know, downscale to community level. So let's exchange the studies, you know, the results and the materials, so long as Mrs. is okay with that, you know, we can exchange, and we should exchange these publications and look at each other's work and collaborate. And that's just a suggestion, is just a remark. So we create a web page where we can just publish the results. So, and once again, my congratulations on the study. Ukraine finally it comes into its own as a proper participant in climate change mitigation. So thank you, Andre. Stephen, would you like to say a few words to conclude this event?
Well, thank you so much. And I assume that Irina may want to say a few words as well. Let's give her the last word. But I want to just thank everyone for this. I remember when this began, I had a chance to sit down with Irina a couple of years ago, and she insisted that, she said, this is fine, but it must be done with the Ukrainian experts. And now I fully appreciate why that was so important, both because there's a tremendous wealth of knowledge and expertise in Ukraine to draw upon, but also because by doing this, it's allowed it to meet better the needs of the Ukrainian stakeholders, both at in government, in the ministries of environment and in the agrarian ministry, but also to work with the research community and to inform local governments and local communities and NGOs. So I really thank Irina for her inspiration to ensure that we worked in a way that was most useful to Ukraine, and just commit that we will continue to be a good partner in this space. And we look to you to guide us, all of you, in how the World Bank can best support you in this very difficult transition that we all face towards both climate mitigation, but very importantly to adaptation that really works for people at the local level, because those are the people who are really going to face the difficulties, but also could potentially turn some of these changes into opportunities if they act sooner rather than later. So thank you everyone for this rich discussion. And perhaps over to Irina, if that's okay with you, Oksana.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stephen. Again, thank you for the work. Дякую також усім колегам, які долучилися до цієї роботи.
Thank you to all the colleagues who were involved in this work, and thanks to all those joining online. Obviously, there's so much more still to be done, and I think this study can set the tone and lay the groundwork for this future inquiry into climate change mitigation. So thank you very much indeed, and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, Happy Holidays, and all the best to you. And looking forward to more of this next year. And thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Happy holidays.
Thank you for joining this.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody. Thank you.
Goodbye.
До побачення.
Побачення.